I'm going to go through some of the tips that you might find useful going into the AP exam, seeing that we're not together anymore before the AP exam. Alright, so I've got in front of me the top 10 student errors on the AP Calc exam. So first one, f double prime equals 0, so that means there's an inflection point there. So what's wrong with that is it has to change concavity. So it's not sufficient for there to be an inflection, for the second derivative to be 0 for it to be an inflection point. So it has to change concavity. Inflection points could be where the second derivative is undefined, or when it's 0, but it has to be where it changes concavity. So, catch up the camera. Okay, f of x is a maximum or minimum when the derivative is 0. Same sort of thing. Just because the derivative is 0 doesn't mean it's a maximum or minimum. Because it could be like that. And there's the derivative being 0. So it has to change direction, obviously. So the derivative could be positive, meaning increasing, and then negative, or vice versa, for it to be an extrema. Average rate of change, you just, okay, so find from A to B, f prime of A plus f prime of B over 2. No, that's not even very close. So average rate of change is just f of B minus f of A over B minus A. So if you're looking for the average derivative, it is s of B minus s of A over B minus A. That's the average derivative. That's the average velocity. Okay, so you don't use the velocity equation, you use position equation. So average velocity is literally just the slope, changing y over the change in x. Volume of disk. So I'll go over shell here when I'm done with these. Okay. The volume of disk says not set in line. Okay, so it's pi big R squared minus little r squared. It's not big R minus r, the quantity squared. You have to do big R squared minus little r squared. Okay, separable differential equations can be solved. So if you have a differential equation, meaning like dy dx, you have to move the y's to the left side. So separate the variables. So don't forget plus c. And solve for c in an initial value problem. So if they tell you what the velocity is at a certain point, you can find the velocity equation. Graders will assume the correct antecedents for all pronouns used in justification. So its can't be, I'll write that. So if you're talking about it, don't say it, say f of x. Another thing, before I forget, like let's say you've got like, we wanted to find where the function crossed the x-axis, and you have to find the 0 or the x-intercept, and say it's x equal 1.348629 or whatever. If you say that that is a, or if you, so a is 1.34, or the book or the test says find a, you can no longer, you don't have to write that every single time. You can just say a, because it's already been defined on your paper. Likewise, if you had like the area, I used a again. Let's say the volume is some integral, and you find a whole solution. You can just call that v from there on out to save a little bit of time. If the correct answer came from a calculator, the grade will assume you are correct. Okay, that's kind of dumb. Yeah, this happens still. Make sure if you have 1 over a linear, if it's linear on the bottom, you have to use logs, natural log. But if it's not linear, if it's x to the 1/2, you'd move it to the top and make it x to the negative 1/2 and do a power rule. If it's x squared, you do the same thing. You've got all different types, but the only time you do natural log is when it's linear on the bottom. And number 10. Don't forget the chain rule. That's what I would sum that up with. Alright. Other things. Make sure you label your number line tests carefully. Okay, so a number line test, if you wanted to check concavity, let's say f double prime of 2 is 0 and f double prime of 4 is 0. A number line test would say we got 2, we've got 4, and this is f double prime. You want to see if it's concave up or down in the interval, so you try 3, and f double prime of 3, let's say it's 10, so that's positive. So that means it's going to be concave up here, and maybe f double prime of 5 is negative 2, so it's going to be concave down here, and say concave down here. Maybe f double prime of 0. So just label your number lines. Make sure you show your work. You're not graded on work for multiple choice, but your free response, they do give partial credit if you get part of the way through the problem. Don't forget plus C, use exact numbers when possible. So if you have the cube root of 5, don't round it to like 2 decimal places. Use it as the exact number the whole way through the problem, and then when you have your 3 decimal places. But don't round it before you do the answer, because it will be wrong, because you'll be off by 1,000th of a point, and then they'll just mark it wrong, which is a shame. So don't round until the end. Store it in your calculator. Hopefully you know how to store, store a number. No? Okay. So if you have square root of 5 equals. Okay, so if I wanted to if I end up getting that number and I'm going to use it throughout, I can store it. It's right here. Hit store, and then you have to you have to store it into a letter, so I'll say alpha A. So now, next time you use that number, just use the letter A, like 5 times A, oops, gives us that.
What is the store button?
It's right there. Oh, okay. Round your final answer to 3 decimal places past the 3 digits past the decimal. So if you get, let's say the answer is this, so you would round it to 1.419. Or if you round it to 1.418, if you truncated it instead of rounded it, you just cut it off, they actually give you credit for that. But it has to be the 3 places. 7, you'd get it wrong. Cross out incorrect work. Incorrect work may lead to loss of points if it's not crossed off. Don't spend time erasing work that is not correct. If you know it's wrong, put an X through it, and they will not look at it when they're grading. Just put an X through it, and they won't even look at it. Consider, let's see, see this on. Do a problem, but you have two ways you think you did. You know how to do it. So you could do it this way, and then you could do it this way. And if you want to leave both of them, they will grade them both. They will find the average of the two and round down. So if it's an 8-point problem, and you get a 7 here, and you get a 3 here. Oh, we'll say you get a 2 here. So you get a 7 and a 2. So that averages to be 9. 9 divided by 2 is 4.5. So you get a 4 if you did that. So if you want to leave parallel problems and you don't, you should consider endpoints when determining max and mins. So find when the first derivative is 0, where it's undefined, and check endpoints if the domain is restricted. And make sure your answer is in the specified domain. Remember that a point is an x and a y value. So if it tells you find the point on the graph where something occurs, the maximum value occurs, make sure it's x comma y. A point means x comma y. Remember the greatest value of the function is returned to the y value. So if they ask you if it's a projectile problem, they tell you, they ask there, give the y value. Or what's the minimum, it's the y value. It says treat parameters generally. I don't know if that's helpful. Have your calculators in radians. For those taking the physics right after the calculus exam, I think don't forget to change it back to degrees. But for calculus, you want it in radians. Don't forget your units. A unit may not be worth the whole point, but you will get it wrong if you don't have the units. So if it'll probably say like answer with units 1 point. So if you have the answer and no units, you'll get it wrong. And remain confident during the test. That's the advice here. Okay, those are do's. Don't write an essay. State the idea or mathematical step and move on. If part A is wrong, you can still get part B correct and part C correct based off of your wrong answer. So if you get like our area thing and we find our wrong intersection point, let's say we got that for the wrong answer, but everything else is correct, and you base, let's say it's region R, maybe you revolve it around the x-axis, and you're still working with the wrong x-intercept, so you'd have the wrong boundary of integration. Whoever is scoring your test will have to do your work or do the problem with your wrong x-intercept, and if you did everything correct after that, you'd get credit. So everything is not wrong just because you make one mistake earlier in the problem. And a lot of times they'll have them independent of each other, but if that's the case, you can still gain all of the work afterwards, assuming you do the right work with the wrong problem. Don't simplify until you need to. I already talked about that. So simplify at the end, not during the problem. Don't use rounded numbers during intermediate calculations. I just said that. Don't use calculator terms. Use standard math notation. So obviously don't do function int of, you would write integral instead of that. Don't use randomly chosen values for the parameter if you're asked about the behavior of some equation with an unspecified constant. Okay. Points are not deducted for incorrect answers, so guess. It used to be some of these standardized tests you would lose points for getting one wrong, like you'd go in the hole potentially. But that's not the case. Don't leave anything blank. Make sure you have a guess for everyone. Don't forget your unit. Don't let mistakes or lack of knowledge break your confidence. Make sure your batteries are charged or your calculator is fully charged. Make sure you know how to find the zeros on your function or your calculator and find integrals and derivatives. They'll have a function, let's say a really gnarly function, and they'll say what's the maximum of this, and it'll be on the calculator part. So you could graph it and then calculate the maximum, like using your calculator, or it might be calculate the maximum of the derivative. Well, if that's the case, then you can graph the derivative on your calculator, and if the derivative, if this is f prime, then you'd use calculate maximum, left bound, right bound guess. So they would assume that you're going to be doing all of that on your calculator. So don't forget to graph the function, graph the derivative. You know how to graph a derivative on your calculator? Okay, good. What else?
Quick question.
Yep.
How would you go about deleting open source? Override it or what?
So if you want to delete a program or something like that, are they requiring you to do that
What?
on your calculator? Are they requiring you to delete programs?
No, I just like stored a number, and then I literally, I didn't want that number stored as that letter anymore.
Oh, storing the number? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know that you, yeah, you could probably, so on this one, let me grab my glasses. It might be under memory stored on, but it like takes up no memory. Yeah, you could just override it.
Okay.
If you wanted to get rid of programs, I don't know if they require you to do that. You'd go to memory here. And then you could delete. And if it's a program, so I only have 2 programs in there. You just click on it, hit clear or delete, and it'll get rid of it. I'm not going to do that. Questions? Alright, so I'll stop there. I can find my cursor.